Sì, dammi 2 minuti ancora che mi sono dimenticato una cosa, scusa, un secondo solo. Ancora Oxford, non è cambiato nulla, ancora Oxford.
Ancora Oxford.
Ok, il principale.
Sì.
Ok.
Cambierò, ma non è cambiato.
Ok. Salve, molto piacere, Marco.
Kevin BRACCONI. Jerry. Thank you very much for coming. No, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, thank you.
La traccia sarà
Sì.
la sintesi di quello di cui discutiamo, le domande che ci poi le proporrò.
Grazie.
Io sono pronto.
So the total session is 1 hour and 15 is what they said, is that right? Is the total session 1 hour 15 or 1 hour? 1 hour 15.
45 minutes
For me? Okay, yeah, yeah. Good, good,
Io ho
good.
pochissimi minuti, ma davvero pochi.
Okay.
Buongiorno e benvenuti a questa seconda giornata del Festival dell'Economia di Trento. Saluto innanzitutto il pubblico che è numeroso, è venuto ad ascoltare anche questa mattina le nostre riflessioni, i nostri dibattiti, e saluto l'ospite di questo panel, Kevin O'Rourke. Buongiorno e benvenuto. E professore di storia economica ad Oxford, studioso da almeno 3 decenni, 2 decenni e mezzo, diciamo così, di relazioni tra l'economia e la storia economica. Di cosa parliamo questa mattina? Qual è il titolo, il nostro titolo di lavoro? Globalizzazione, le reazioni alla globalizzazione, che cosa ci insegna la storia? Io, per non togliere troppo spazio alle argomentazioni di ROURKE, che ha molte slide anche da mostrarvi, vorrei separare rapidamente questo titolo di lavoro nelle 3 parole da cui è composto: globalizzazione, reazioni, storia. Globalizzazione, espansione dei mercati sovranazionali, libero scambio, la circolazione delle persone, il sistema in cui viviamo, comprese le spinte contrarie, dalla Brexit a Trump, ai sovranismi francesi, italiani o sparsi nel resto d'Europa. Le 2 cose si tengono, ne parleremo a lungo con ROURKE tra poco, perché la globalizzazione ha sempre vincitori e perdenti. Questa è la tesi di fondo del libro con cui nel 99 ROURKE, qui edito per il Mulino, in cui ROURKE cercava di trarre un parallelo, affinità e divergenze, avremmo detto con un filo di ironia, tra quanto è accaduto nell'Ottocento, nel XIX secolo, soprattutto dopo i primi 20 anni del secolo, nell'area atlantica, e quanto poi è avvenuto nel dopoguerra della Seconda Guerra Mondiale. In mezzo c'è la Grande Depressione, ci sono gli anni tra le 2 guerre, ci sono le autarchie, con tutto quello che appunto la storia ci ha insegnato. Su queste questioni, su quanto la globalizzazione oggi produce o può produrre e ha prodotto in passato istanze, repliche, risposte di chiusura, cioè specularmente opposte, su queste questioni ROURKE ha molto da insegnarci, perché da storico sostiene che la storia ha molto da insegnarci, perché non esistono una globalizzazione e una deglobalizzazione, non esiste un ciclo da declinarsi al singolare. Questo ciclo è da declinarsi al plurale, globalizzazioni e deglobalizzazioni, perché le risposte non sono le stesse, i contesti sociali, economici e culturali nei quali le diverse fasi di globalizzazione hanno insistito sono diversi, diversi sono i vincitori e diversi i perdenti. Quindi il tema di fondo torna ad essere, è inevitabile, quello delle diseguaglianze, anche se il lavoro di ROURKE sulle convergenze, per esempio, ci invita ad essere molto prudenti sulla generalizzazione della questione disuguaglianze, perché vanno anch'esse studiate e declinate attraverso parametri diversi e attraverso vettori diversi che portano a destinatari diversi, sia i beneficiari, coloro che risultano beneficiati dai processi di globalizzazione, sia coloro che ne risultano non soltanto esclusi, ma anche preoccupati, impauriti per quello che rischiano di perdere, ancor più forse per quello che hanno perso. La lettura della globalizzazione e della fase contemporanea, anche se l'intervento di ROURKE si concentrerà molto appunto sul racconto di quello che è successo nella prima globalizzazione appunto dell'Ottocento e sulla risposta all'inizio del Novecento, la risposta, la replica, la reazione. Ebbene, sulla globalizzazione si discute molto in termini molto diversi, dipende anche dalle rispettive visuali, dagli angoli attraverso i quali viene studiato il fenomeno. Ci sono le suggestioni come quelle di Ian Goldin, che pensa a quella di oggi come un'età dell'oro, del nuovo rinascimento, con un filo di ottimismo, forse. Oppure ci sono le riflessioni di Colin Crouch sul tema, viste più dal lato politologico, ma nelle quali il tema del malgoverno della globalizzazione è molto presente. Ne parleremo prima di dare la parola a ROURKE. L'ultimo libro, non tradotto ancora purtroppo in italiano, di Kevin ROURKE è Una breve storia della Brexit, e appunto questo ci conduce immediatamente alla seconda parola del nostro titolo di lavoro: reazioni. Che cos'è la Brexit se non una fortissima reazione? E queste reazioni all'apertura, all'integrazione hanno nomi e cognomi, appunto si chiamano Brexit, ma si chiamano Trump, Salvini, Le Pen. Si chiamano, se parliamo invece di storia delle idee, nazionalismi, spinte protezionistiche, guerre commerciali, chiusura delle frontiere o dei porti. E nascono queste reazioni e poi crescono, credo che ROURKE ne parlerà tra pochissimo, molto meglio di me, per l'inconsapevolezza dei vincitori, di quelli che in qualche modo promuovono l'apertura, l'inconsapevolezza dei contraccolpi. E su questo la storia davvero ha molto da insegnarci, perché la storia, terza parola del titolo del nostro panel, ci invita a comprendere a fondo i meccanismi delle passate ondate di globalizzazione, che non è un meccanismo inedito come in passato è stato detto a proposito del dopoguerra, è uno stop and go, almeno così potremmo definirlo, lasciando la palla a Kevin o ROURKE, uno stop and go che ha le sue espansioni e le sue a volte brutali contrazioni. Però perché è importante parlare di questo? Ecco, forse prima dello speech di ROURKE è questo il punto da sottolineare. È importante perché la posta in gioco oggi, come lo era ieri, e lo abbiamo visto purtroppo, è molto alta. Sul piatto non ci sono soltanto l'accrescimento del benessere delle persone e dei singoli stati. C'è la tenuta dei nostri sistemi politici, c'è la qualità della libertà, in ultima analisi c'è anche la pace, non solo quella sociale. Non è un caso forse che ROURKE stia lavorando in questi mesi a ricerche sul rapporto tra il commercio e i conflitti e la guerra. Ecco, questo ci dice quanto è alta oggi la posta in gioco, ci dice anche forse quanto è usato e abusato il ricorso, la ricorrenza continua, simbolica nel dibattito pubblico mainstream agli anni 30, alle circostanze degli anni che abbiamo già vissuto e che per molti versi, ne parliamo tra un attimo, ci possono ricordare quanto accade oggi e ci possono istruire più che ricordare quanto accade oggi. Ecco però un riferimento meccanico, senza la cura, lo studio dettagliato dei fatti, è esattamente forse il modo migliore per non capire oggi quali possono essere i veri rischi e i veri pericoli, e quindi di fare della storia. Qui siamo anche ospiti della terza che insomma su questo tema ci accompagna da decenni, è forse il modo migliore per non fare storia ma per trasformare la storia in un feticcio. Invece il riferimento al passato è importante solo se siamo capaci di decriptarlo. Io lascio la parola a ROURKE, ho già parlato troppo, ma metto sul tavolo della sua relazione, se ne avrà voglia nel finale, un paio di questioni. La prima è inevitabile: che impressione ha, a partire dalle sue riflessioni del passato e quelle di oggi, dei risultati delle elezioni europee? Mi sembra una questione inevitabile che su questi temi, visto che si discuteva appunto della reazione possibile a un'idea di apertura, di integrazione, di relazioni globali. E la seconda questione riguarda il rapporto tra il neoliberismo, il principale attore dell'attuale globalizzazione, e i sovranismi, i nazionalismi, i populismi, e questo ci conduce al tema generale del Festival Economia di quest'anno. Colin Crouch sostiene che la globalizzazione può fare benissimo a meno di sistemi democratici aperti e che nazionalismi e sovranismi sono di fatto il segnale di un divorzio tra il neoliberismo e il conservatorismo. Credo che Kevin ROURKE non sia d'accordo, ma magari sarà lui stesso a parlarcene. Grazie.
Grazie. Allora, vorrei cominciare per scusare perché non posso parlare professionalmente in italiano. Ho scritto le slides in italiano. Dove sono le slides? Ah, no? Yeah? Well, this isn't going to make the slides come. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, now you can hear. Okay, ho capito. Well, spero che le slides sono in italiano e spero che sarà utile per voi. Okay, so I want to talk today about the backlash, the reaction against globalization that we're all aware of in Europe, but also in America. And I think that there are lots of things to be worried about. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't exaggerate yet. So here, for example, is a slide showing the relationship between trade and GDP, PIL, at the world level. And as you can see, in 2013, 14, 15, it was no longer rising. And the fact that it was no longer rising was viewed as deeply disturbing. And as you can see in 2015, the Washington Post said that globalization might be coming to an end. And of course, they became even more apocalyptic in 2016 when we had Brexit and when we had Trump. But it's always important to remember, scusa Marco, but that sometimes journalists can exaggerate, and that you can't always extrapolate immediate trends and assume that this will happen forever. So it's important to stress that globalization has not come to an end yet. It's true. Oh, and by the way, this is the same picture for Italy, and Italy is just a very typical country. You're open, and you're becoming more open. The same as everywhere else in the world is becoming more open. Now, it's true that we're all very worried about Donald Trump's trade wars. And yet, it's also important to stress that this is not the 1930s. So this is the US average tariff since forever until 2017. So 2017, not 2019. So presumably they went up a little bit. But this is not the 1930s. We don't have widespread quotas, exchange rates biased against imports, exchange controls. We're not in the 1930s yet. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be worried, but it's important not to exaggerate. And yet there has clearly been an important reaction against globalization. So that's what I want to talk about today, and I want to put it in a little bit of historical context. But first, I want to remind you of this fable written by Aesop many, many years ago. If he existed, we think he may have existed. And I suppose he didn't write it, I suppose he told it, but it was eventually written down. And it's a story about a tree, an oak tree, who is, we have to imagine him speaking in a sort of a slightly Germanic accent, because he's a tree who believes in rules. He's a very proud and principled tree. And these rules should always be followed, no matter what the circumstances. And this tree is quite dismissive of his flexible friend, the reeds, who are these little things here, the reeds. Where are they? There's the reeds. And because they go this way and that, the wind blows one way, they blow one way. The wind blows the other way, they blow the other way. They have no consistency. In England in the 1980s, you would have said that they were a little bit wet, which is what Mrs. Thatcher called the left-wing ministers that she was trying to depose. The Reeds maybe have a southern accent. Well, of course, we know how the story ends. There's a big storm, and the oak tree ends up flat in its arse, and the reeds are still standing. And the moral of the story is that we live in a world where there are unpredictable shocks. They always happen. There are always shocks. And the moral of the story is that therefore you need shock absorbers. They're useful if you're a plant, they're useful if you're a car, they're useful if you're a political or an economic system. And what I want to suggest is that maybe some of the shock absorbers that history told us we needed have been allowed to erode in recent years, maybe because people thought that would be efficient, but it actually turns out to be quite costly because of the political reactions that you get, which are predictable. So I want to, in particularly, today talk about two historical episodes that I think speak to us today. The first is the story of how the first great globalization of the late 19th century undermined itself because it created winners and losers. And the second is the story of protectionism between the two wars, which was catastrophic. And of course, it wasn't the protectionism that was the most catastrophic aspect of what happened. So let me first of all talk about the first great globalization. So Marco kindly mentioned that book.
This globalization had political causes and it had technological causes. So politically, what you had was, first of all, a gradual liberalization of commercial policy beginning in Britain, but spreading to the rest of Europe after 1815. So quotas were eliminated and tariffs gradually were reduced after the end of the war. And the Europeans very kindly extended the benefits of free trade to their colonies, whether their colonies wanted it or not. And they were so generous that they sometimes extended the benefits of free trade also to countries like China that were, or Persia or Thailand that weren't their colonies, or Japan, but they got it anyway. And this is something that the Chinese are still quite angry about. So imperialism was an important force making for globalization during this period. In parts of the world other than Europe, where countries were free to choose, they often chose protection, actually. That was true in North America, and it was true in South America also. But Africa, Asia were largely exposed to free trade during this period. An important requirement for the globalization of this period was the fact that the 19th century was quite peaceful by Europe's terrible standards. I mean, there were important wars of unification in Italy, as you know, in Germany, and there was the Crimean War, and we know how the story is going to end in 1914. And yet the fact remains that if you take battlefield deaths in war as a percentage of population, in the 19th century, it was only 1/7 of what it had been in the 18th century. I guess we're counting the Napoleonic Wars as being 18th century for this purpose, which is correct because the 19th century goes, as we know, from 1815 to 1914. So it was a peaceful period that was largely caused by the fact that we had a hegemon, the British. They were the hegemon at sea. I mean, the Russians maybe had a hegemony further to the east, but the British, to a large extent, performed the same services that the US Navy has been performing since 1945 in keeping the seas open for everybody, and something that is now under threat, as we know, in various parts of the world. So in that kind of context, you then had scope for the new technologies of the 19th century to really bring markets closer together, steamships, railroads, the telegraph. Okay, what's globalization? Well, you all know that if you have supply curves and demand curves, then equilibrium, it's where the two curves intersect. Actually, it doesn't matter what the model is. Equilibrium is always where the two curves intersect, or maybe where they're tangential to each other. But if there's transport costs, then there's the prices of the good in the importing market are higher than in the exporting market, because it's costly to get the good from one market to the other. So globalization is when trade costs fall. In the 19th century, trade costs fell. This is an index of shipping costs into Britain, which collapses after about 1840. At precisely the same time, you see the wheat trade between England and America explode. And at exactly the same time, you see the price gap, the gap between prices of wheat in England and America, collapsing. So that's globalization. And globalization implies both winners and losers. So who are the winners? Well, workers got cheap food. That was good for the workers. Landowners in Europe didn't get as much money for their output. That was bad for the landowners. In England, which was open throughout and fully exposed to these globalization forces, the income of landowners falls by about 50%. Here's a slide where you have the incomes of landowners relative to the incomes of workers in England. In Denmark, they collapse in both cases. So there's a big shift in income distribution, because in Europe, you basically have now landowners facing competition from vast expanses of very cheap land in America and Argentina and so on. And so their incomes inevitably fall. And so there's a predictable political reaction in France, in Germany, in Italy. Italy protects agriculture. It's completely typical. There's nothing unusual about Italy. You look just like, for example, Germany during this period. And this was inevitable because agricultural interests were still politically powerful in Italy at this time. They weren't in England. That's why in England you could maintain free trade. Okay? And at the end of our book, we have this long quote, which was written 20 years ago. So, politici, giornalisti, analisti, hanno la tendenza a estrapolare l'immediato passato per applicarlo all'indefinito futuro. And so we're always going to have more and more globalization, but history suggests otherwise. Globalization can go into reverse. La globalizzazione dell'Ottocento, per lunghi dall'essere frenato di eventi politici esogeni e inaspettati, la guerra di 1914, si è almeno in parte autodistrutta, because it created winners and losers, and the losers objected, and they got tariffs. And by the way, in the Americas, they also got restrictions on immigration. And there's a story there too that I don't have time to go into. And so we end up by saying that, look, if you're a politician and you don't care about winners and losers, you might find that globalization went into reverse. And that the point is not that we were prophetic. The point is that in the 1990s, there were lots of people worrying about this already in America. And then Elhanan will remember this whole debate about whether our wages were being shaped by Beijing. And this is why people were worried about it. And this is why myself and Jeff Williamson framed the book in the way that we did. So, okay, this thing is just not working, is it? The pointer. The pointer's not working, okay. But we were writing about here. And so here you've had a long phase where average wages in America are stagnating, and people are worried about this. There's already been a couple of presidential candidates that don't do well who are essentially protectionist. Now, I should say that history is always complicated. Real wages start to recover after 2000, and it's after 2000 that China really becomes important. So, the links between globalization and inequality are complicated, and yet, this is Piketty's point, since 1980, the incomes of the 50% poorest people in America have increased by 1%. Well, that's just pathetic, It's just pathetic. And in Britain, median incomes since 2008 have fallen by 10%. That's also pretty pathetic. But an important point is that this is not inevitable, because if you look at the same figure, not for America, but for France, if you look at the incomes of the poorest 50% in France, they haven't gone up by 1%, they've gone up by 20 or 30%. So you have choices as societies. You don't actually have to choose to go down the Anglo-American route if you want to. But that is the way that they went down. It's maybe not surprising that that's where the reactions were in 2016. And, the point that people are making now more and more, there are some economists making these points, but if you just look at the electoral map of Europe, it's clear that what we have ultimately is a regional problem. If you draw the map of France, you look at the coal fields, and you look at the vote for Le Pen, and they look kind of similar. So we have problems with regions that are deindustrializing, and some people say they should just all move. They should just all go to California. Well, I mean, in France it's more complicated, but even in America, that reaction ignores something rather fundamental about human beings, which is a lot of us actually care about the place we came from. And we're not necessarily going to be happy to see the place we come from decline. If you look at the UK vote for Brexit, here we have the vote for UKIP, the vote for UKIP, and here we have immigration, and here we have how exposed the regions were to Chinese competition. Actually, there's no correlation with the immigration. If anything, where there's more migrants, they're more likely to vote against Brexit. Think about London, But there is a clear correlation. Those parts of Britain that in the 1980s were producing goods that later would face Chinese competition are much more likely to vote for Brexit. So I think there is a relationship here between globalization and the Brexit vote. So what are the shock absorbers? Well, we know what the shock absorbers are, we think, and they emerge during the first great globalization. So the origins of social security are to be found precisely in the period between 1880 and the First World War. So this is when we have accident compensation, unemployment insurance, old age insurance, pensions coming in. Also in Italy, you were a little bit slower, but it happens also in Italy. Now, an important point to make is that if you look at how much of this social insurance you do, you find that you get more of it in more open countries. So there is not a race to the bottom here. It's not the case that the more open you are, the less you can do to help people. Actually, the more open you were, the more you did to help people. How that worked politically in practice is, for example, in Belgium, you have a political coalition between the socialists and the liberals. The socialists say we will support markets and free trade if you, the liberals, support the introduction of social insurance programs. So there's no reason why you can't have political coalitions giving you both at the same time. And that positive correlation was still positive as late as the 1980s and 1990s. So this is a famous paper by Danny Roderick, written in the 1990s. So using data that, it's already 20, 30 years out of date, but still in the 1980s and 1990s, it was the case that the more open you were, other things being equal, the bigger your government was. Now, you could say that it's become more difficult now, with capital being mobile, and we're all chasing the capital. You could say that, but look at Europe. Look at the European Union. 28 countries. Never in the history of the world have you had 28 countries more tightly integrated than the EU, and yet you have very liberal countries like Britain, with a small government, and you have countries like Denmark that look completely different. So, even when you have that much integration, countries can still make very different choices if they want to. So I think, there is this view that, you can't have a welfare state with globalization. I think that if you're on the right, you say that because you don't want the welfare state. If you're on the left of a certain sort, you say that because you don't want globalization. But it may actually not be true. And if you care about markets, maybe you should welcome that, because maybe these shock absorbers are necessary to protect the markets in the long run. And it's not just that you can have welfare states that protect workers. Of course, it isn't just about protecting workers in terms of giving them unemployment insurance. You have to think about giving them jobs as well, because that's what they ultimately want. But governments can do something there as well, I think. But free trade agreements themselves can also protect. We think of free trade agreements now as always tearing down existing standards. But it doesn't have to be that way. And historically, actually, it hasn't been that way. If you go back to the 19th century, there are many examples of trade agreements where the deal is, we will lower our tariffs if you raise your social standards. In 1904, there was an agreement between France and Italy on migration. Italians are moving to France. The French are saying they're coming to get our social insurance. They're coming to get our welfare benefits. What's the solution? You still have the right to move to France, but Italy raises its standards to French levels. So you can have deals between countries that are progressive. They don't always have to be deregulatory. And of course, the best example of this is the Treaty of Rome. And this is a quote from Alan Milward, and his book is emphasizing that in the 1950s, what was Europe trying to do? It was trying to create a bigger market, which we needed for prosperity, but it did not want the cost of that to be a race to the bottom, so that the social standards would be undermined, because we had just lived through the 1930s and we knew that that was too difficult. And so if you look at the Treaty of Rome, it's right there in 1957. You get all of this stuff about the right to work, about social security, about hygienic work conditions, protection against professional illnesses, rights to collective action as trade unions, equal pay for men and women, big deal in a country like Ireland when we joined in 1973, stuff about paid vacations. And if you look at our current negotiations with the British, we know that one thing that we are absolutely clear about is that we want there to be level playing field guarantees. Like, there is no way that they are going to allow the British to deregulate and have free access to our markets. Which, by the way, does raise, I think, the question of why you would necessarily want to have a very deep behind-the-borders type of agreement with a country like America. I mean, it's a legitimate question, and I don't think, we're in a pretty globalized world already, and maybe you shouldn't exaggerate, Okay, so I think that these lessons of the past have often been forgotten. these welfare safety nets have been eroded, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries. It's important to remember that austerity in Britain had nothing to do with Europe. Nothing to do with Europe. They're not in the euro. They're not subject to European fiscal conditions. This is purely ideological and driven by David Cameron and his Chancellor, George Osborne. And there's a very clear statistical correlation also between austerity and the Brexit vote. So in those parts of Britain where austerity hit the hardest, where you get the longest increases in queues for housing or health services, that's also where the Brexit vote is the highest. So they're suffering a shock, a deindustrialization shock, like many parts of the world. They need those social security nets, and the Chancellor takes it away from them. I guess because he thinks this will be good for business. But it turns out to be really bad for business, because the political consequence is Brexit. So it doesn't matter how right-wing you are, you do have to sometimes think about the political consequences of your actions, especially if they are as predictable as this one. Now, having said that, I should say that the story of Brexit's complicated. I've stressed economic causes. There surely are also non-economic causes. There are very rich people in the south of England who have concerns about sovereignty. There are rich people in the south of England who don't like foreigners. You probably want to think about Russian interference, fake news, and all of that kind of stuff. There are stories about the funding of the Brexit campaign. But the point is, you don't have to choose, and you shouldn't want to choose, between economic explanations for Brexit or Trump and cultural explanations. Both of those votes were very tight. Every vote counted, right? You take away any part of their coalition, and they don't win. Okay, so it's a complicated story, and I think that this debate about whether the causes are cultural, economic, I think it's in part a culture, it's in part an ideological debate, you know. It's as if the left can't cope with the notion that there might be some economic causes, because that would in some sense be justifying these votes. Well, I think that's self-defeating, because you need to get rid of those causes if you're going to prevent this stuff from getting worse in the future. And yeah, you can read all about it in this book, and it would be great if you could read about it in Italian. Okay. Secondly, there's the interwar period, where everything breaks down much more dramatically than today, and this is entirely due to the Great Depression. So it is not true that the Great Depression is caused by protectionism. That's rubbish. Nobody believes that who studied the Great Depression, okay? It's the Great Depression that causes the protection. But the problem is that the protection then has all sorts of other implications, in particular, I think, political ones and geopolitical ones. And that's actually why I'm mostly worried about what's happening today. So let's just remind ourselves of what happened. So these are interest rates, central bank discount rates. The red line is what happened this time, and then the blue lines or the green lines are what happened in the 1930s. And what you can see is that in the 1930s, interest rates were kept very high. You know, they were kept high because people were trying to stay on the gold standard. They were trying to keep on to fixed exchange rate systems. This time around, everywhere, interest rates fell quickly, even in the Eurozone, which was the slowest, and which utterly perversely raised interest rates twice in 2011. Okay, so the Eurozone was the worst of them, but even there, they eventually got their act together. This is budget deficits in the interwar period, and I have put on a red line, and the red line is budget is 3% of GDP. Now, why we care about 3% of GDP? Well, who knows why we care about 3% of GDP? Well, the good news is, folks, that all of these guys almost, not Mussolini when he was invading Africa, I mean, things went, that cost a lot of money, but basically most of these guys were very, very responsible. They all stuck to the Maastricht guidelines, which is great news, except it's not great news, right? Because if you're in the middle of the Great Depression and you want to limit your budget deficit to, say, 3% of GDP, you're going to have to raise taxes and cut expenditure at the worst point in the cycle, and you're going to cause a Great Depression. There were a couple of countries this time around who had to do that because nobody was going to lend them money. So that was true in Ireland, it was true in Estonia, and we had Great Depression-sized falls in income. We had sort of 10, 15, 20% falls in income. But we're little countries. That doesn't matter. In the Great Depression, it was Germany doing this. It was America doing this. And so we ended up with a proper Great Depression. So an important shock absorber is what we call automatic stabilizers. You don't have to do Keynesian things. It's good if you do. But even if you just don't have austerity in the middle of the crisis, that will cause deficits to increase, and that will stabilize the economy to some extent. So here you can see the balances. So this is the surpluses, and it goes down, which means you're going into deficit. And there is a move towards deficits in the interwar period. It's much, much bigger, that move towards deficits after 2008, and that was a good thing. That was a good thing. The combination of that plus the loose monetary policy meant that in 2009 we were already recovering. Whereas in the interwar period, things went down and down and down for 3-4 years. And it's when the economy slides for 3, 4, 5 years that people lose hope and start turning to extremist parties who offer easy solutions. Okay. There's a clear link between how long you stayed on the gold standard and how protectionist you were. And yes, well, this is basically saying that when you recovered from the Great Depression, depended on when you left the gold standard and when you left this fixed exchange rate with gold, the sooner you do it, the quicker you get out of the Great Depression. And those who stay on gold the longest are the most protectionist, because they have, they're in deep crisis, and so they end up having to do this politically. So they were trying to be orthodox by sticking to gold, and they ended up being very unorthodox in terms of what they were doing to the international trading system. And of course, there were graver consequences yet. So this is the unemployment rate in Germany and the vote for the Nazis, and we know this story. Now, here's a book that you really all should read. I don't know if it's in Italian, but it's a great book. And the theme of the book is summarized by its cover. Okay, so it's basically a family history of all of the parties on the left going through to the interwar period. And one of the things that she's saying is that in many countries like Germany, the SPD in the 30s was still an orthodox Marxist party. And so they weren't actually going to offer you useful policies to get out of the Great Depression because they were waiting for capitalism to collapse. So in a country like Sweden, they had already become social democrat. So they were saying, you know what, you're in trouble, we're going to help you. And if you offer the people that, they go for it. But then there are other countries where there's nobody doing that. The SPD, they're waiting for capitalism to collapse. The liberals are hopeless. They just want to leave it to the market, And then when other people come and say, you know what, we want to help you, you end up going for them. So here you have two election posters, and the one on the top, it's exactly like the one on the bottom. The one on the bottom, work and bread. The one on the top, it's work for all and higher purchasing power, And in countries like Ireland as well, we had governments that said we're going to intervene in the economy to protect you. And people went for that. So it was an absolute tragedy what happened, because it was unnecessary at some level. If people had been willing to think outside the box earlier, we might not have had everything that we ended up having. Okay? So in that context, let's talk about the Eurozone. It's not a happy story. This is GDP after the crisis. And what you see is that it's the Anglo-Saxon countries that are the best at recovering. And that's because in America, you had loose monetary policy and, reasonably, a bit of loose fiscal policy. In Britain, you had austerity, but you had loose monetary policy, So America does better than Britain. Britain does better than the Eurozone. The Germans do well because they're exporting to China. But if you take Germany out of the Eurozone, what you see is the Eurozone has only recovered by 2016, 8 years later. I mean, that's completely pathetic, and let's not even talk about Italy. And if you prefer GDP per capita, actually it gets worse. The Eurozone outside of Germany has only recovered by 2017. So are we surprised that there has been a political reaction? I mean, we should not be surprised that there's a political reaction. The surprise, I think, is that the political reaction hasn't been more systemic, in my view. You put this on top of the longer-run stresses and strains associated with deindustrialization and globalization and so on. And I mean, I think the centre is doing pretty good, doing pretty well, but it's obviously in deep trouble, And the question is, what do we do about it? And really, the real worry, is that it could have been worse. And when this guy is gone, it could be worse. So this is your compatriot trying to show the Germans how German he is, how Prussian he is, when he first gets his job. Luckily, he wasn't being sincere. And so when he took over from Trichet, things almost immediately got better. He made his promise to do whatever he takes the central bank starts being more unorthodox, and the Eurozone economy finally starts to recover, many years too late. And one of the worrying things that we all have to think about is what's going to happen after Draghi, because it could be a real ideologue. You know, it could be somebody who's not pragmatic and who's going to want to follow rules, who's going to be more like that oak tree and less like the reeds. Yeah, so I think I've said that. So I'm sort of getting towards winding up now. I think that Brexit, at least in Northern Europe, at least if you're Irish, let's say, I mean, but all of Britain's immediate neighbours, I mean, we can all now see, thinking about Brexit, just how useful Europe is. You know, we've all gotten used to a Europe without borders. We've gotten so used to them that we don't think about them anymore. Actually, the Brexiteers, they've gotten so used to them that they think that they can do whatever the hell they want and there won't be borders. But that's wrong, right? There's nothing normal about a borderless Europe. It's a very odd thing, okay? And I think we're really learning to appreciate the implication of a borderless Europe and the usefulness of a borderless Europe, not only economically, but politically as well. And my country is the best example of that. And I think that also when you look at British people, half of whom are very happy to be leaving, but the other half of whom are absolutely distraught at losing their European citizenship. I mean, you understand that actually this thing about being European is hugely important for people. But we're still in trouble. We're in big trouble. I don't want to exaggerate. There have been moves towards making the Eurozone architecture a little bit less dysfunctional, but we don't have deposit insurance. We don't have deposit insurance, which means that a euro in a Greek bank or an Italian bank is not, in the event of a crisis, the same as a euro in a German bank. And that's just crazy, because the one thing that we know is that there will always be another crisis. And you don't know when it's going to happen, but there will always be another crisis. And you get the sense that they're not going to make any further moves towards further integration unless there's another crisis. But who knows what the other crisis will bring. You know, you don't have a proper monetary union if the euro in a bank in one country is not the same as a euro in a bank in another country. That's not a proper monetary union, folks. So that's very, very dangerous. And it's also the case that too many of our politicians in Europe are too conservative when it comes to fiscal policy in particular. And the real worry is that, as we can see in this country and around Europe, is that the reserves of democratic and political capital and pro-European sentiment have been eroding. You know, they're still there, but they've been eroding. And if there's another shock, what will happen next? You know, so these guys, you know, they're wasting time. So we need shock absorbers that are macroeconomic also. That's my second conclusion. Finally, what are the real costs of all of this? I mean, if Trump puts on a 10% tariff, it's not great. It's not the end of the world, but that's not the problem, in my view. In my view, the real problems that we face are political and geopolitical. You can see that in Italy, of course. You know, there are political issues here. You think about Le Pen. Think about what would happen to Europe if Le Pen ever got into power. God forbid. That would be the end of the project. So there clearly are political costs here, but there are also geopolitical costs. And they're worth thinking about as well. So I have a book where I talk, as Marco mentioned, about the links between war and trade. And trade is a reflection of the geopolitical equilibrium of the day. But trade can also have an impact on geopolitics. And in particular, what makes me worried is that there are rising powers like China that we have to absorb into the political system. We've never done a very good job of absorbing rising powers in the past. And these countries like China, they have to buy raw materials in from the rest of the world. And that means that they need a multilateral trading system to interact with. And you tamper with that trading system at your peril. To me, the thing to be most scared about is the way that Trump is undermining the World Trade Organization, the way that he's refusing to replace judges in the court in Geneva. I mean, he clearly wants to just destroy the World Trade Organization. So, you know, he wants to replace the rule of law with the law of the jungle. And I suppose he wants to do that because he figures he's a big beast. And maybe he is, but there are other big beasts there as well. We're in a multipolar world. That's not great, I don't think. It's dangerous enough. He risks making it much more dangerous. So to conclude, really now, finally to conclude, when you think about those bigger stakes, You then have to think about, the real costs and the real benefits of maintaining existing levels of social protection in rich democracies. A certain sort of liberal politician will say, look, we can't afford this. It's costing tax revenue to pay for decent pensions for people, and so we can't afford this. But if you think about all the political risks that you run, if you get rid of, if you undermine people's security, I mean, maybe you can't afford not to pay this, and maybe this is actually a pretty cheap investment in our political futures. And maybe those people, like myself, I suppose, who are broadly speaking liberal and who broadly speaking think that trade is a good thing, especially in my case, I suppose, for political reasons, maybe rather than always, there's this bicycle metaphor, the metaphor of the bicycle. We must always move further forward or else we will fall over. They use that metaphor in the European context all the time. It's a dangerous metaphor. Maybe you should just declare victory. Say, we live in a very globalized world. Let's try to keep what we have, and let's try to focus on shoring up political support for what we have, and that means focusing on the people and on the regions who are being left behind. That's what I wanted to say.
Grazie anche per aver rispettato alla perfezione i tempi del nostro panel. Credo che abbiamo ancora un quarto d'ora circa, poco più di un quarto d'ora per le domande dal pubblico che arriveranno tra un attimo. Io ne faccio soltanto un paio implicitamente. Mi sembra che la risposta sull'Europa e sui segnali arrivati dalle elezioni mi sembra che siano già arrivate dallo speech di O'Rourke. Quello che vorrei chiedergli in modo diretto, prima di ascoltare le domande dal pubblico, è come immagina questa nuova protezione. Ecco, le conclusioni che io trovo molto interessanti, cioè piuttosto che continuare a spingere oltre, prendiamo atto quasi freudianamente della vittoria raggiunta e temporeggio un attimo perché c'è un problema con la traduzione, appunto. Cioè, prendiamo atto della globalizzazione in atto e avvenuta e occupiamoci adesso, piuttosto che portarla alle estreme conseguenze, di tutte le falle sociali che questo processo ha aperto. È certamente una proposta molto più che suggestiva, molto interessante, perché è una terza via e non vorrei usare, formule che poi non si sono rivelate particolarmente fortunate rispetto appunto alle idee ordoliberiste di una globalizzazione senza limiti, alle quali poi si contrappongono quelle legate a sogni di decrescita che si rivelano ogni volta che prendono piede nel dibattito globale, si rivelano più o meno irrealistici. E allora la domanda è questa: il sistema di protezione, l'approccio, quando O'Rourke dice si può scegliere, guardate che cosa è successo in questo paese o in quest'altro, non è vero che la politica non ha più nulla da fare, non è soltanto un ostaggio dei mercati, come nel nostro dibattito mainstream siamo abituati a leggere e ad ascoltare. E però questo modello di protezione di fronte a una globalizzazione così estesa, come può avvenire attraverso gli stati nazionali? Servono modelli politici sovranazionali più forti, molto più forti e molto più incisivi dell'Unione Europea come l'abbiamo conosciuto o delle altre organizzazioni. Come può lo Stato nazionale oggi trovare, con le complessità e le criticità di cui abbiamo detto a lungo, di cui O'Rourke ci ha parlato a lungo, come può trovare oggi in questo sistema, nel sistema della connessione globale digitale, tra l'altro, come può lo Stato nazionale fornire, ipotizzare e poi realizzare strumenti capaci di proteggere davvero i perdenti o chi teme di perdere dal futuro?
Okay, so two responses. Firstly, you mentioned their nation states being hostages to markets, or how can we avoid them being hostages to markets? And it's very simple. You can do whatever you want so long as you pay for it yourself. So, you know, you can have a well-developed welfare system paying decent pensions and all the rest of it if you pay for it yourself out of taxes, which the Scandinavians do. You know, you become a hostage to markets if you're borrowing all the time, because then indeed you need the markets to lend to you. So you don't have a sensible centre-left social democratic political program without being willing to pay for it. So that's the first point. And then the second point is that I think, well, you talk about supranational institutions. I mean, let's just focus on Europe. I mean, I think Macron, I'm basically with Macron. I shouldn't be, because I'm Irish, which means I'm a citizen of the new Hansa League, which makes sense for us politically, because we now have lost our former best friend and we need new friends. And the Scandinavians and the Dutch and so on are our logical friends. But I think so I'm in favour of that politically, but I think they're completely wrong when it comes to the architecture of the Eurozone. I mean, I think Macron is right that if you want a single currency to work, you need an element of fiscal transfers. That doesn't mean one-way transfers towards the south from Germany all the time. That doesn't work. That's not what's required technically, and it will never work politically. You know, but you need mutual insurance schemes. And, you know, the old French idea of having, you know, for example, some sort of Eurozone, or actually I would prefer EU level taxes on whether they be carbon taxes, whether they be taxes on IT companies or whatever they are, right? That then are used to refinance unemployment insurance systems, for example, so that if you have a severe downturn, you know, you're in less trouble than you would otherwise be. I think that's a sensible kind of mutual insurance system at the Eurozone level. So, you know, I think ultimately, you know, if you did have the centre, you know, taking in a decent chunk of tax revenue and sending it out again, it would make the whole thing more stable. I don't think that's politically envisageable, but you could imagine small steps along the lines of an unemployment system that would help. You know, but I do think that the more important point for all of us to bear in mind is that, you know, if you want protection, you got to pay for it, and that's okay. You know, and so what you need is leaders who make voters understand that if you pay, you know, that's in your interests, and that's what, you know, these leaders that I suppose I'm nostalgic for from the 50s and 60s were able to do, and that's what we need going forward, because there clearly is a demand for protection. I mean, that's, I guess, largely the Salvini vote, I suppose. It's, you know, it's lots of things, but I suppose in part it's a vote for protection. It may be other things as well.
Io direi che se qualcuno dal pubblico ha delle domande, questo è il momento di farlo. Ecco, vedo una mano che si alza, so che c'è qualcuno con il microfono, un'altra ancora, ecco, due sono lì, prego.
My English is much worse than the new Italian, so I'll speak Italian. So, yeah. Per quello che riguarda l'assicurazione dei depositi, bisognerebbe considerare come sono le banche italiane. Dal Veneto alla Liguria alla Puglia noi sappiamo che per decenni i risparmi dei depositanti sono stati usati per fare favore agli amici, e questa è la causa dei loro fallimenti. Inoltre sappiamo che le banche italiane sono piene di debito pubblico italiano, e la rischiosità del debito pubblico italiano è misurata dallo spread, e chi conosce questo paese sa che lo spread dovrebbe essere ancora molto maggiore di quello che è. Allora, come si può pretendere in questo modo che i risparmiatori tedeschi paghino per il free riding degli italiani? Questa sarebbe la ricetta per far vincere l'Allianz für Deutschland, e così anche la Germania diventerebbe sovranista come la Polonia e l'Ungheria.
Vogliamo ascoltare anche la seconda domanda e poi rispondiamo entrambi insieme? D'accordo, grazie.
Just quickly before I forget, I mean, I think I would say two things. I would say two things. Firstly, I think this notion of sovereign debt getting a zero risk weighting or whatever
as we currently have is mad. You know, I mean, we know that sovereign debt is risky, and rules should take that into account. But secondly, I mean, to be positive in a way, it's not just Italian banks who have problems. I mean, actually, German banks have big problems too, you know. And what we need to move mutual insurance systems forward is we need the Germans to understand that they might sometimes benefit from these things as well. And so in a perverse way, the fragility of the German banking system may be one of the positive features on the landscape right now. But they may only realize when it's too late.
Ecco, accanto...
Grazie. Innanzitutto, sì, un attimo. Innanzitutto complimenti per la lezione estremamente lucida e ne è valsa proprio la pena, voglio dire, lo dico sinceramente. Lei nell'ultimo cartello dice: disinnescare queste tensioni si può, costa un poco, ma ne vale la pena. Ora, in termini di costi, fa riferimento al valore della protezione sociale aggiunta che bisogna implementare. Ci sono altre componenti di questi costi? È stata fatta una stima di quanto verrebbero a costare alle finanze dei singoli un sistema più tranquillizzante? Faccio un esempio: in Italia c'è un timore enorme, come in tutta Europa, dell'avvento della patrimoniale, che poi nei fatti già si è realizzato con l'aumento della tassazione sulle rendite finanziarie un po' di tempo fa. Questo può essere il modo, quindi non la patrimoniale, non terrorizziamo nessuno, ma un maggiore contributo di chi può a poter far sì che l'Europa resti unita, salda e riesca, come dire, a stare in equilibrio rispetto alle potenze adesso che dominano gli Stati Uniti, la Cina, un po' meno la Russia e l'India che si affaccia sul mercato, si affaccia nella nostra realtà. E poi un'altra domanda: se lei dovesse dare un'indicazione su quale parte dell'architettura europea bisogna dare una priorità, qual è questa? Grazie.
Grazie.
I'd answer. I think the second question is the one. I think completing the banking union has got to be the priority, because without a banking union, you don't have a monetary union worthy of the name, and you're storing up huge risks of major systemic crises going forward. So I think that would be my priority, really. Yeah.
E la prima domanda ROURKE che faceva il...
Well, I don't have any particular views on exactly how you should structure your tax systems in Italy, I admit. I'm happy to defer to your collective expertise on that.
Ecco, si parlava appunto della patrimoniale e della possibilità, una discussione sulla patrimoniale, tra l'altro, se non sbaglio, rilanciata proprio ieri da Massimo D'Alema in un'intervista a Repubblica. Ancora una domanda per ROURKE.
Professor O'Rourke, a question about common European foreign policy. It could be useful to contribute to protection as well as to reduce reaction, in your opinion?
The question, sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Yes, the question is about the common European foreign policies.
Yes.
Yes, it can contribute to protection and at the same time reduce the risk of reaction to globalization.
So are you suggesting that if European citizens see Europe behaving as a unit in relation to its neighbours, then in some ways that can help diffuse tensions in Europe? Is that the question?
Yes.
Thinking about migration flows, for example, or where are you coming from? I guess migration flows is one area where, you know, we can potentially, well, we are already actually acting together, aren't we? And there, I guess, is pretty obviously a link between our foreign policy actions and our external development actions and migration flows. Well, you know, you look at something like the Ukraine, and very often it seems like when we've done things jointly, we've made things worse, actually. So, you know, I think I would say that if you're the sort of person who worries about secular stagnation, and Joel Mokyr has just left the room, and if you're worried about a systemic lack of spending at the European level, especially in Germany, and if you're worried about Europe's strategic weakness, the fact that we seem to be completely dependent on America, which is no longer a dependable ally, well, it does seem that rearmament would hit several targets at once. It'd be a way of spending money, creating jobs, and making us more secure. But I guess the Germans, I guess, don't want that, right? But that probably would help in various ways.
Thank you.
E di qua la prossima domanda, da questa parte.
Grazie. Volevo sapere se nei suoi studi è stato tenuto conto, soprattutto per l'uso degli ammortizzatori. Ritengo che la metafora che lei, con cui ha introdotto il suo discorso è estremamente intrigante. Si è tenuto presente che ci sono differenti livelli di qualità della pubblica amministrazione e quindi tutta la filiera della pubblica amministrazione che in qualche modo mettono in esercizio gli ammortizzatori sociali, e la differenza con cui e la qualità con cui le mettono in esercizio può far sì che nella comunità europea alcuni corrano più veloce e altri invece restino al palo nella attuazione delle politiche di ammortizzatori, diciamo.
Okay, so the question is, are some countries better equipped administratively to have social protection, social shock absorbers than others? I guess that was the question. Well, maybe. Maybe, but there are different sorts of shock absorbers. So, and I suppose the quality of administration, I suppose, would matter, especially if you're trying to think of new policies and you're trying to be flexible and reacting to new situations and this kind of thing. But if you have an established system of taxes and transfers, I mean, you just have to run that, and people will be protected by it. If you have a government that is hiring X number of people, those people's jobs and the jobs of the people who depend on them, I mean, they're hired. And you could have not very clever bureaucrats, but they'd still be hired and the job would still be done. I mean, I can see where you're probably coming from. And of course, the quality of public administration matters, especially politically. But, I think if people were setting up tax and transfer systems in the 19th century when, in the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s and 50s, when probably there were a lot fewer civil servants around. So I think it's fairly basic stuff, actually. I don't think you need to be a genius to figure it out.
Dall'altra parte della sala, eccoci qui.
So the problem with your shock absorbers is that usually the people who would most benefit from them are the ones who vote against them. What do you do about that?
Well, it isn't clear to me that the ones who would most benefit against them are always voting against the shock absorbers. I think they're maybe voting against the people who I think are imposing shocks on them. I think that's what's going on in their heads, And I mean, I think if you look at, for example, Denmark right now, and that's an interesting one, right there, the SPD has sort of gone back to basics, and they've cleaned up, My sense is, if you look at the populists in Scandinavia before the SPD started cleaning up, what were they saying? They were actually saying that the liberals, the centre-right or whatever, were undermining the welfare state, and that was their big pitch. So I think that in Europe, maybe not in America. This may be one. America's very different here, maybe, but I think in Europe, a lot of the populist vote is there to be reclaimed by the centre-left. If the centre-left starts distinguishing itself from the centre-right. So I mean, I would be one of the people who think that one of the great catastrophes in Germany is the SPD constantly going into coalition with the CDU. So then you're saying to people, you have no choice.
you know, in the center, you know. So I'm in favor of the center right moving further to the right. I'm in favor of the center left moving further to the left, you know. I'd be in favor of the SPD turning to the Greens and Die Linke in Germany. So I think the two continents are fundamentally different that way. So essentially what the Danish populists or the Swedish populists would be doing, they'd be saying, we're in favor of the welfare state, but it's a club good. You know, you got to be a member of the club to get it. That's kind of a way to think of it. And actually what the SPD now are doing is they're saying, well, we don't believe in completely open borders either, which makes sense because actually nobody does. It's a complete straw man. And once they made that move, they started shooting up in the polls again.
È una situazione che assomiglia anche molto, almeno per come è stata percepita, a quella italiana. Non c'è mai stata una coalizione tra destra e sinistra di governo in senso stretto, c'è stata però l'esperienza Monti e c'è stata una generale percezione politica di assenza di scelta rispetto ai partiti di riferimento di massa di quel periodo lì. E poi dopo pochissimo tempo colpisce moltissimo l'accelerazione, diciamo movimenti e partiti di tutt'altra natura, reazioni, le chiamerebbe ROURKE appunto, hanno preso piede fino a conquistare la maggioranza parlamentare, ma soprattutto una forma di egemonia culturale da cui è oggi difficile diciamo uscire e nella quale in molti si sentono comunque a disagio. Io, se non ci sono altre domande dal pubblico, vorrei chiudere con un'ultima domanda rispetto alle protezioni, perché proprio il mondo anglosassone è stato all'avanguardia storicamente nell'idea dei sussidi di disoccupazione, dei redditi di cittadinanza, chiamiamoli come vogliamo, redditi di inclusione, eccetera. Io vorrei capire ROURKE cosa pensa nella fase attuale, oggi, di strumenti che i critici in Italia definiscono di natura assistenziale e vorrei capire se invece per lui hanno un valore protettivo. Mi riferisco esplicitamente al reddito di cittadinanza italiano, ma il discorso ovviamente può valere per strumenti analoghi in diversi luoghi del mondo occidentale.
I think about basic income is that we should all go and listen to Hilary Hines, who's giving the Alan Kruger lecture on precisely this topic just around the corner, because she's the one who knows about it.
D'accordo, un maestro di diplomazia, Kevin ROURKE, lo ringraziamo anche per questo. Grazie a tutti e ovviamente buon proseguimento con gli altri dibattiti di questa bellissima iniziativa diffusa qui a Trento. Grazie e buona giornata. Grazie.